In the spring of 1959, Viktor Sukhodrev, a young Soviet interpreter accompanying Nikita Khrushchev's delegation to America, stood speechless before a suburban San Francisco high school. What had rendered this seasoned diplomat, a man who had navigated the treacherous waters of Cold War diplomacy, utterly astounded was not some advanced military technology or industrial marvel. It was a parking lot. A simple high school parking lot filled with rows of gleaming automobiles that, as he would soon learn, belonged not to teachers or administrators, but to the students themselves, teenagers with their own cars. The concept was so alien to Soviet reality that Sukhodrev initially refused to believe it. "It must be some kind of Potemkin demonstration," he reportedly whispered to a colleague. "Americans are staging this to impress us." When the delegation's American guide insisted it was completely ordinary, Khrushchev himself demanded verification. Upon confirmation, the Soviet leader simply shook his head in disbelief, later telling his inner circle that this single observation had taught him more about the fundamental differences between the American and Soviet systems than any diplomatic briefing ever could. Before we dive into this extraordinary story, tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? It's incredible to see our historical community spread across the world. And if you're new here, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Each subscription helps us continue unearthing these fascinating stories that shaped our world. Now, let's get to the story. This cultural collision represents perhaps one of the most striking yet underappreciated moments of the Cold War, when the material prosperity of ordinary Americans, particularly its youth, became a more potent weapon in the ideological battle than any missile or tank. While much attention has been paid to the grand geopolitical chess moves of the era, this narrative explores a more intimate battlefield, the driveways, highways, and high school parking lots where American teenagers exercised a freedom so commonplace to them, yet so unimaginable to their Soviet counterparts, that it became a source of genuine ideological crisis for the communist system. The automobile in mid-century America was far more than a method of transportation. It represented freedom, social status, technological prowess, and economic might, all wrapped in chrome and steel. For American teenagers between the 1950s and 1980s, getting a driver's license and eventually a car of one's own represented a rite of passage, a step toward adulthood, and an emblem of the American promise that each generation would surpass the previous one in prosperity and possibility. Meanwhile, in the Soviet Union, even many accomplished adults might spend a decade on waiting lists for the chance to purchase a modest Lada or Moskvich, often at costs equivalent to several years' salary. The story begins in the aftermath of World War II, when America's factories, untouched by enemy bombs, smoothly transitioned from producing tanks and aircraft to manufacturing consumer goods. Detroit's assembly lines roared back to life, churning out automobiles at a rate and scale unprecedented in human history. General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler, the Big Three, were not just companies but institutions that reshaped the American landscape itself, stretching highways across the continent and spawning suburbs that were designed around the assumption of universal car ownership. By contrast, the Soviet Union, devastated by the war with an estimated 27 million dead and its industrial heartland in ruins, faced the monumental task of rebuilding. Under Stalin's direction, resources were channeled into heavy industry, military rebuilding, and prestige projects like the atomic bomb program. Consumer goods, especially luxury items like private automobiles, were deemed frivolous bourgeois indulgences, incompatible with socialist principles, and impractical, given the dire economic circumstances. This divergence in priorities created two radically different relationships with the automobile. In America, car culture permeated every aspect of society: drive-in movies, drive-through restaurants, cross-country family vacations, and the ubiquitous suburban garage. Cars became extensions of personal identity, with brands, models, and customizations reflecting one's personality, aspirations, and place in society. For teenagers especially, cars represented liberation from parental oversight, venues for socialization and romance, and status symbols among peers. In the Soviet Union, however, the few private cars that existed were utilitarian necessities, typically reserved for important officials, distinguished scientists, celebrated artists, or other members of the nomenklatura, the privileged elite of the communist system. The idea that an ordinary citizen, let alone a teenager, might own a personal vehicle was almost inconceivable. Public transportation, efficient if not glamorous, was the norm for the vast majority of Soviet citizens. The bus, tram, and the magnificent Moscow Metro were the arteries of Soviet urban life, not the personal automobile. This stark contrast became particularly evident during the series of cultural exchanges and diplomatic visits that characterized the Khrushchev era's brief thaw in Cold War tensions. Soviet delegations prepared for America's skyscrapers and factories found themselves utterly unprepared for the sheer abundance of everyday life in the United States, particularly the proliferation of private automobiles. It was one thing to read statistics about American car ownership in a briefing paper. It was quite another to witness teenagers casually driving to school in vehicles that would be the envy of a Soviet factory director. One such moment of cultural collision occurred during the famous kitchen debate of 1959, when Vice President Richard Nixon and Premier Nikita Khrushchev toured the American National Exhibition in Moscow. While the formal debate centered on a model American kitchen, observers noted Khrushchev's particular fixation with the display of American automobiles. The Soviet leader, attempting to project confidence, boasted that the USSR would soon catch up in car production. A junior member of the Soviet delegation, Georgy Arbatov, who would later become a key advisor on American affairs, wrote in his memoirs that Khrushchev was visibly shaken after learning that, in America, even workers on assembly lines could afford the very cars they were building. More shocking still was the revelation that their teenage children often had cars of their own, a fact that Khrushchev initially refused to believe until presented with photographic evidence and statistics. What he couldn't admit publicly was how far behind they truly were, not just in numbers but in the very concept of who could own a car and what it meant in society. "How can children own automobiles?" he reportedly asked an American journalist. "Who gives them such expensive gifts?" This cannot be typical. When told that many teenagers worked part-time jobs to buy their own cars or received family hand-me-downs when parents upgraded to newer models, Khrushchev was equally bewildered. The concept of a secondary market for affordable used cars was alien to the Soviet experience, where automobiles were so scarce that they appreciated rather than depreciated over time. The automobile gap was not merely a matter of production numbers, though these were stark enough. By 1960, the United States had produced its 100 millionth car and had more registered vehicles than licensed drivers. The Soviet Union, despite having a larger population, had fewer than 1 million privately owned cars. But the deeper distinction lay in what these numbers represented. In America, the car had become democratized, accessible across social classes, and integrated into the fabric of daily life in ways that were simply unimaginable in Soviet society. This reality presented a significant ideological problem for Soviet authorities. Marxist-Leninist doctrine had long predicted that capitalism would create ever-widening inequality, with luxury goods concentrated in the hands of the exploitative few, while the masses lived in deprivation. The sight of American factory workers driving to work and high school students with their own cars directly contradicted this narrative. It suggested something profoundly troubling to the Soviet ideological worldview, that capitalism might actually deliver material prosperity to ordinary citizens more effectively than socialism. Soviet propaganda attempted to counter this uncomfortable reality in several ways. Some efforts focused on disparaging American car culture as wasteful, environmentally destructive, and spiritually hollow, arguments that carried some legitimacy but often rang hollow, coming from a system that simply couldn't produce enough cars to create similar problems. Other propaganda acknowledged America's material abundance, but attributed it to the exploitation of third-world countries and the historical advantages of a nation untouched by the devastation of World War II. More sophisticated responses came from Soviet sociologists who developed the concept of Veshchism, roughly translatable as thing-ism or materialism, as a critique of American consumer culture. In this view, Americans' attachment to possessions like personal automobiles represented not prosperity, but a spiritual poverty, a substitution of material goods for meaningful human connections and social purpose. This critique found particular application to American youth portrayed in Soviet media as superficial, status-obsessed, and morally adrift despite, or because of, their material privileges like personal cars. Yet behind closed doors, Soviet leaders recognized the persuasive power of American abundance, particularly its widespread distribution across society. Anastas Mikoyan, who visited the United States in 1936 and again in 1959, warned his colleagues that the American standard of living represents a form of ideological warfare more powerful than their military. He specifically noted how the normality of car ownership among regular Americans, including young people, created an aspirational image that communist propaganda struggled to counter. The automobile gap had practical implications for Soviet citizens beyond mere consumer envy. In a society where private transportation was rare, personal mobility was significantly constrained. American teenagers could drive to neighboring towns, take spontaneous road trips, or simply find privacy away from parental supervision in ways their Soviet counterparts could not imagine. This freedom of movement translated into a different relationship with both geography and authority, creating what some Soviet observers nervously termed horizons of possibility that were substantially broader in American society. This mobility gap became especially evident in cultural depictions of youth. American films, music, and literature of the 1950s through 1970s are filled with automobiles as central elements of teenage life, from the street racing in American Graffiti to the countless songs celebrating cars and driving. Bruce Springsteen's Racing in the Street, the Beach Boys' Little Deuce Coupe, and Springsteen's Born to Run all connected youthful identity with automobile ownership. When these cultural products made their way, officially or through smuggled copies, into Soviet society, they presented a vision of teenage life utterly foreign to Soviet youth. Soviet teenagers, by contrast, relied predominantly on public transportation, bicycles, or simply walking. While the Soviet system had many virtues, including excellent public transit in major cities, it couldn't match the personal freedom embodied by the American teenager with car keys in hand. This created a potent symbol that required no translation or ideological explanation. It spoke directly to fundamental human desires for autonomy, status, and possibility. Perhaps most significantly, the teenage car owner represented something particularly challenging to the Soviet system: individualism as a mainstream rather than dissident value. In America, a teenager saving for, selecting, purchasing, and customizing a car was engaged in a profoundly individual exercise of choice and self-expression. The diversity of available models, colors, and aftermarket modifications allowed for personal statement in ways difficult to achieve in the more standardized Soviet context. The contrast wasn't just economic but philosophical. Different conceptions of the relationship between individual and society made visible in sheet metal and chrome. This cultural divide became increasingly apparent through the 1960s as more Soviets gained first-hand exposure to American society through expanded cultural exchanges, diplomatic missions, and limited tourism. Alexander Yakovlev, who would later become a key architect of Gorbachev's reforms, spent a year at Columbia University in 1958-1959. In his writings, he specifically mentioned his amazement at seeing students, mere students, driving their own automobiles, as a moment that forced him to question certain Soviet assumptions about American society. Similarly, Soviet journalist Melor Sturwa, during his posting as a Pravda correspondent in the United States, wrote a series of articles meant to critique American materialism, but which inadvertently highlighted the gap in living standards. In one piece, he described watching teenagers at a California high school casually driving newer and better cars than most Soviet ministers possessed, concluding with the observation that this abundance is America's most dangerous weapon in the struggle for hearts and minds. As the 1960s progressed into the 1970s, the automobile gap showed no signs of closing. While Soviet production of passenger cars did increase under Khrushchev and Brezhnev, creating iconic models like the Lada and Volga, private car ownership remained a distant dream for most citizens. The waiting list for purchasing a new car often stretched to 7 or 8 years, with full payment required up front. Even then, consumers had little choice in model or features, and quality control issues were notorious. Meanwhile, American teenagers continued to receive cars as graduation presents, purchase them with summer job earnings, or inherit older family vehicles as their parents upgraded. This disparity became increasingly difficult to hide from the Soviet population. Despite restrictions on foreign travel and media, information about Western living standards trickled in through multiple channels. Smuggled magazines showed American teen life centered around cars. Foreign radio broadcasts described a society where 16-year-olds routinely received driver's licenses, and often cars, soon after. Perhaps most powerfully, the limited number of American films approved for Soviet distribution, carefully selected to highlight social problems in capitalist society, nevertheless revealed backgrounds filled with private automobiles used by ordinary citizens, including young people. By the mid-1970s, Soviet authorities faced a growing credibility gap. The promised overtaking of American living standards remained clearly unfulfilled, with the automobile serving as perhaps the most visible metric of this failure. Soviet economists calculated that at current production rates, achieving American levels of car ownership would take well over a century. More worryingly, surveys of Soviet youth increasingly showed awareness of and fascination with Western consumer goods, with cars frequently mentioned as symbols of the lifestyle they aspired to. The teenage driver became a particularly potent symbol precisely because it represented not just wealth, but a specific kind of freedom that resonated with universal, youthful desires. A Soviet adult might rationalize the lack of private cars through ideology or patriotism, but teenagers, in any society, are notoriously resistant to such abstractions when they conflict with immediate desires for autonomy and status among peers. The image of American teens with their own wheels became a persistent challenge to Soviet claims of having created a superior social system. This challenge intensified during the 1970s, as détente brought increased contact between the superpowers. Cultural exchanges frequently included visits by Soviet educators, youth organization leaders, and social scientists to American high schools and colleges, where the student parking lots never failed to create a powerful impression. One Soviet education official, after visiting a public high school in a middle-class Ohio suburb in 1973, wrote a confidential report expressing alarm at the casual affluence on display, particularly noting that approximately 60% of upperclassmen possess their own automobiles, creating expectations impossible to fulfill in our system for decades to come. The official was right to be concerned. As Soviet society moved into the late 1970s and early 1980s, Cynicism among younger generations about the gap between propaganda and reality grew increasingly obvious. Youth subcultures emerged that explicitly embraced Western symbols and attitudes, with the American car serving as a particularly powerful object of fascination. Samizdat, underground self-published youth magazines frequently featured cut-out images from Western car magazines. A particularly popular poster among Soviet teens featured a Chevrolet Corvette, a vehicle so far removed from Soviet reality it might as well have been a spacecraft. The automobile gap created particularly acute contradictions for the children of the Soviet elite, the nomenklatura, who had greater exposure to Western standards through their parents' privileged positions. These teenagers, attending special schools and sometimes traveling abroad, developed a keen awareness of what their American counterparts took for granted. The sons and daughters of high Communist Party officials sometimes had access to imported cars, creating visible inequality that directly contradicted socialist principles and generated resentment among their peers. This dynamic was vividly captured in a confidential KGB report from 1980 that warned about the ideological contamination of elite youth in Moscow. The report specifically mentioned unhealthy interest in Western consumer items and noted the particular fascination with automobiles, quoting one teenager, the son of a ministry official, who reportedly said, "In America, every teenager has a better car than our ministers. What does that tell you about which system works better?" Such sentiments, expressing questioning of the system in material rather than abstract philosophical terms, represented a particularly dangerous challenge to Soviet authority. By the early 1980s, the leadership recognized the problem, but had few realistic solutions. The Soviet economy, increasingly stagnant, could not hope to match American production of consumer goods while maintaining military parity and supporting satellite states. Resource allocation remained skewed heavily toward heavy industry and defense, with consumer sectors perpetually shortchanged. The automobile industry specifically suffered from outdated production techniques, inadequate investment, and a profound misunderstanding of consumer desires for choice, quality, and personal expression through vehicle ownership. Meanwhile, across the ocean, American teenagers continued their love affair with the automobile, unaware of how their ordinary rites of passage, getting a license, saving for a car, cruising with friends on weekends, represented a profound ideological challenge to a competing superpower. The high school parking lot, filled with everything from hand-me-down family sedans to shiny new graduation presents, stood as an unintended but extraordinarily effective exhibit of capitalist prosperity accessible to ordinary citizens, including its youth. This prosperity was not without its critics, even within American society. The 1970s brought an energy crisis, growing environmental concerns and questions about the sustainability of car-centered development. Films like American Graffiti, 1973, already viewed the teenage car culture of the late 1950s and early 1960s with nostalgia, suggesting awareness that this particular expression of American abundance faced challenges. Nevertheless, the contrast with Soviet reality remained stark, and the fundamental expectation that teenagers would drive, and often own, cars persisted through economic ups and downs. While Soviet propaganda made much of these American challenges, particularly during the oil shocks and economic turmoil of the 1970s, the underlying reality remained undeniable. A typical American family might delay purchasing a new car during a recession, but the expectation that each licensed driver in the household, including teenagers, should have access to a vehicle remained largely intact. By contrast, even during the relative economic stability of the Brezhnev era, private car ownership remained an almost unattainable luxury for most Soviet citizens. This persistent gap contributed to what political scientists would later identify as a crisis of legitimacy in the late Soviet system. The promise of communism had always been fundamentally material. That socialist organization of the economy would ultimately deliver greater prosperity than capitalism. When this claim became increasingly difficult to maintain, particularly regarding visible consumer goods like automobiles, the ideological foundations of the system were undermined. The teenager with a car came to represent not just a specific consumer product, but a broader failure of the Soviet economic model to deliver on its core promises. This crisis became increasingly difficult to manage as information controls weakened in the late Soviet period. Western radio broadcasts, smuggled magazines and films, increased tourism in both directions, and the expansion of cultural exchanges all contributed to greater Soviet awareness of Western living standards. By the early 1980s, even official Soviet media occasionally acknowledged the gap, though typically attributing it to historical circumstances rather than systemic failures. One particularly influential moment came in 1982 when a documentary film called The Car and Ivan received limited distribution in the USSR. While ostensibly a critique of American materialism, its footage of ordinary American life, including teenage drivers, created such a powerful impression that authorities quickly restricted its showing. Audience surveys revealed that viewers were less focused on the film's critical narrative than on the background images of material abundance, particularly the casual ubiquity of private automobiles across age groups and social classes. Soviet leader Yuri Andropov, who took power following Brezhnev's death in 1982, was acutely aware of these challenges. As the former head of the KGB, he had seen the classified reports on public opinion and recognized the danger posed by the growing gap between expectations and reality, particularly among younger generations. His brief tenure saw limited attempts to address consumer desires, including modest increases in automobile production, but systemic constraints and his failing health prevented significant progress. What could never be publicly acknowledged, but was increasingly understood within the higher levels of the Soviet government, was that the automobile gap represented not just a failure of production, but a fundamental misconception about modernity itself. The Soviet system had been built on the assumption that central planning could more efficiently allocate resources than market mechanisms. The persistent inability to produce cars in quantities and varieties that approached Western levels suggested a deeper problem with the entire economic model. This realization contributed to the intellectual groundwork for the reforms that would eventually emerge under Mikhail Gorbachev in the mid-1980s. While rarely discussed in these terms publicly, the automobile gap, and particularly its impact on youth attitudes, formed part of the mounting evidence that fundamental rather than incremental changes were needed. By the time Gorbachev came to power in 1985, the prospect of achieving Western levels of automobile ownership under the existing system had become so remote that it represented an existential challenge to Soviet claims of building a superior society. As glasnost, openness, gradually lifted information controls, Soviet citizens gained even greater awareness of Western living standards. American films showing teenagers casually driving their own cars no longer needed to be smuggled in, but could be shown in official theaters. Magazines displaying the latest models from Detroit, Tokyo, and Munich became legally available. Western television programs, with their background assumptions of universal car ownership, reached Soviet audiences through various channels. This new transparency created a particularly acute crisis for parents in the Soviet system. How could they explain to their children why American teenagers had access to a level of mobility and autonomy that seemed like fantasy in the USSR? The generation gap took on ideological dimensions, with older Soviets sometimes defending the system, while their children increasingly looked westward for models and aspirations. The automobile became a powerful symbol in this generational divide, representing fundamentally different expectations about what constituted a normal life. A study conducted by Soviet sociologists in 1987, later published during the Glasnost era, revealed striking attitudes among high school students in major Soviet cities. When asked about their image of the United States Over 70% mentioned teenagers with their own cars as one of the first associations. When asked what single change would most improve their own lives, family ownership of a car ranked first among urban youth, above housing improvements or better food supplies. Most tellingly, when asked if they believed they would own a car by age 25, less than 15% expressed confidence they would, a stark indicator of declining faith in the Soviet future. The implications extended beyond consumer envy into fundamental questions about societal organization. American teenage drivers represented not just material prosperity, but a different relationship between youth and society, individual and state. The extensive driver's education programs in American high schools, the complex system of licensing, insurance, and registration, and the entire infrastructure supporting teenage driving demonstrated a society that expected and enabled its youth to manage significant responsibility at an early age. This contrasted sharply with the more paternalistic Soviet approach to youth development. In the United States, a 16-year-old could, after proper training and licensing, operate a powerful machine, navigate public roads, and enjoy remarkable freedom of movement with minimal direct supervision. This reality reflected broader American assumptions about individual responsibility and rights that stood in philosophical opposition to Soviet collectivist principles. The teenage driver thus represented not just a consumer disparity, but a fundamentally different conception of the relationship between citizen and state. This philosophical dimension became increasingly apparent in discussions among Soviet intellectuals during the Glasnost period. Andrei Sakharov, the famous dissident physicist who was allowed to return from exile under Gorbachev, specifically mentioned the autonomy gap between American and Soviet youth in his writings on necessary reforms. While not focusing exclusively on cars, he noted how the material conditions of teenage life in the two superpowers created entirely different expectations about individual agency versus collective obligation. Similarly, sociologist Tatiana Zaslavskaya, an influential voice in the perestroika reforms, included the automobile gap in her analysis of factors contributing to social frustration among Soviet youth. Her research suggested that young people increasingly measured Soviet society against Western alternatives using visible lifestyle metrics rather than abstract ideological principles. The teenager with a car became, in her analysis, a particularly powerful symbol because it combined material prosperity with personal freedom, twin desires that the Soviet system struggled to satisfy. As the 1980s progressed, the gradual opening of Soviet society exposed more citizens to Western realities, not just through media, but through increased personal contact. Tourism in both directions expanded, business delegations grew more frequent, and educational exchanges multiplied. Each interaction provided further evidence of the gap in living standards, with the ubiquity of cars among American youth serving as a particularly visible indicator. Soviet teenagers who had opportunities to visit the United States returned with stories that seemed almost fantastical to their peers. One exchange student who spent a semester at a Michigan high school in 1988 wrote in his journal, later published, "On my first day, my host brother, just 17 years old, drove me to school in his own car, a Ford Mustang that he had purchased with money from a summer job. He spoke about this car with more passion than most Soviet people speak about anything. When I told him that, in Moscow, even most adults don't own cars, he thought I was joking." Such direct exposures proved far more powerful than any propaganda. The abstract statistics about Soviet economic challenges acquired concrete meaning when personalized through such comparisons. The teenager with a car represented not just an economic disparity, but a different set of possibilities for life, possibilities that Soviet youth increasingly aspired to, but saw little prospect of achieving within their system. The accumulation of such realizations contributed significantly to the crisis of faith in the Soviet future that characterized the late 1980s. Young people in particular developed what some sociologists termed horizon envy, an acute awareness that their Western counterparts enjoyed broader options and opportunities, symbolized most visibly by the freedom of movement embodied in the teenage driver. This awareness created a generation increasingly detached from official ideology and skeptical of the system's capacity for meaningful reform. By 1989, as revolutions swept across Eastern Europe and cracks in the Soviet system widened, the automobile gap had become just one facet of a broader recognition that the communist experiment had failed to deliver its promised prosperity. The Berlin Wall fell, and with it the information barriers that had once limited Eastern Bloc citizens' understanding of Western living standards. The teenage driver, once a distant image glimpsed through carefully controlled media, became a direct aspiration as young people across the former communist world imagined new possibilities. The ultimate collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 had complex and multiple causes, from economic stagnation to nationalist movements to the arms race. Yet, in the lived experience of many citizens, particularly younger ones, the persistent failure to deliver consumer prosperity compared to the West played a crucial delegitimizing role. The teenager with a car, once an object of disbelief during Khrushchev's American tour, had become a powerful symbol of all that the Soviet system had promised but failed to provide. In the post-Soviet era, car ownership expanded rapidly across the former USSR, though not always in ways that benefited society. The chaotic privatization of the 1990s created a new class of wealthy elites who quickly adopted Western consumption patterns, including luxury automobiles for themselves and their children. In Moscow, the sight of teenagers driving Mercedes and BMWs became a striking symbol of new inequalities, replacing the old nomenclatura privileges with even more extreme wealth disparities. For average citizens, however, car ownership did gradually become more accessible, though never reaching American levels. The used car markets developed, import restrictions eased, and new manufacturing joint ventures with Western companies increased availability. By the early 2000s, driving schools had proliferated across Russia and other post-Soviet states, and obtaining a license at age 18, the legal minimum, had become a common rite of passage for urban youth, though still not universal as in America. American car culture itself evolved significantly during these decades. The energy crises of the 1970s, growing environmental awareness, and economic challenges modified the teenage driving experience. Smaller, more efficient cars replaced the gas-guzzling behemoths of the 1950s and 1960s. Insurance rates for young drivers skyrocketed, making car ownership more financially challenging. Many cities improved public transportation options, and some studies began showing declining interest in driving among American teenagers in the early 21st century. Nevertheless, the expectation that a teenager would learn to drive, and often have access to a vehicle, remained ingrained in American culture through the end of the 20th century and beyond. Driver's education continued in most high schools. Obtaining a license at 16 remained a milestone, and parking lots at American secondary schools continued to fill with student-driven vehicles, a sight that still surprises visitors from countries where such youth autonomy remains uncommon. This persistent cultural difference reflects something deeper than economic disparities. It speaks to fundamentally different conceptions of youth, responsibility, freedom, and the relationship between individual and society. The American teenager with a car embodies particular values, mobility, independence, individual responsibility, that align with broader cultural emphasis on personal freedom and spatial mobility. The normalization of teenage driving in America represents a societal choice to prioritize individual autonomy over certain collective considerations, with both benefits and costs. For those who lived through the Cold War on the eastern side, the contrast remains memorable. Mikhail Gorbachev, in his memoirs, specifically mentioned his first visit to Canada in 1983, where he was struck by the casual affluence of ordinary people, particularly the young. He recalled asking his host about teenagers driving their own cars and being told it was completely normal, a moment he described as making him understand viscerally, not just intellectually, the depth of our economic problems. Similarly, Vladimir Posner, the Soviet journalist who became famous for his appearances on American television during the 1980s, has written about the automobile shock he experienced during his first extended stay in the United States. Though familiar with America from earlier periods in his life, he noted that nothing had prepared him for seeing high school parking lots filled with students' cars, and how this tangible evidence of prosperity affected his understanding of the competing systems. Even ordinary citizens retain powerful memories of this disparity. Surveys of Russians who lived through the late Soviet period consistently mention learning about Western living standards as a significant factor in their disillusionment with communism. The teenage driver frequently appears in these recollections alongside other symbols of American abundance that seemed particularly striking in comparison to Soviet austerity. What made the automobile gap particularly potent was its visibility and comprehensibility. Unlike abstract economic statistics or complex technological achievements, car ownership represented a form of prosperity that required no explanation. When Soviet citizens saw American teenagers driving their own vehicles, whether in person during visits or through increasingly available media, they understood immediately what this represented about the respective economic systems. This understanding operated at multiple levels. At the most basic, it demonstrated production capacity. The American economy simply made more cars, making them accessible even to young people. At a deeper level, it revealed different priorities in resource allocation. America chose to direct substantial resources toward individual mobility and consumer satisfaction rather than concentrating on heavy industry or military power. Most profoundly, it reflected philosophical differences about individual freedom versus collective organization, with the teenage driver embodying America's emphasis on personal autonomy. The Cold War is often portrayed primarily as a military standoff or an ideological debate conducted through propaganda. Yet, in the lived experience of ordinary citizens, particularly younger generations, it was often experienced most powerfully through such material and lifestyle contrasts. The teenager with a car became, almost accidentally, one of America's most effective ambassadors, demonstrating through everyday life a prosperity and freedom that communist propaganda struggled to counter. This dynamic was understood by some American policymakers who argued for increased cultural exchanges and information flow into the Soviet bloc. George Kennan, the architect of America's containment policy, argued as early as the 1950s that exposure to American living standards would ultimately prove more powerful than military pressure in challenging Soviet legitimacy. By the 1980s, this approach had become more explicit, with increased efforts to showcase American lifestyle through exchanges, exhibitions, and media penetration. What these policymakers understood was that ideological arguments rarely persuade on their own. Abstract debates about capitalism versus communism had limited impact compared to tangible lifestyle differences. The American teenager with car keys in hand represented a form of freedom that required no theoretical explanation. It spoke directly to universal human desires for autonomy, status, and possibility. As the Cold War recedes into history, this aspect of the conflict deserves greater recognition. While diplomatic negotiations, military posturing, and espionage operations dominate historical accounts, the ultimate resolution came partly through ordinary citizens losing faith in the communist future. This loss of faith was fueled by growing awareness of alternatives, with visible lifestyle disparities, like teenage drivers, playing a crucial role in making abstract systemic differences concrete and personally relevant. This perspective helps explain why the Soviet system ultimately collapsed with relatively little violence despite its massive military power. By the late 1980s, Even many of those within the system had lost confidence in its ability to deliver the prosperity it had long promised. The teenage driver, once dismissed as a capitalist extravagance, had become a powerful symbol of all that the Soviet economy could not provide, contributing to a broader crisis of legitimacy that peaceful reform could not resolve. In the post-Cold War world, elements of American consumer culture, including car ownership patterns, spread globally with mixed results. In some former communist countries, acquiring Western consumer goods, especially automobiles, became a primary aspiration, sometimes at the expense of other social values. The environmental and urban planning challenges of car-centered development, long visible in America, reproduced themselves in societies rushing to adopt similar mobility patterns. Yet the fundamental appeal that made the teenage driver such a powerful Cold War symbol remains understandable. The ability to move freely, to control one's own transportation, to extend one's geographical horizons, these represent universal human desires that transcend political systems. The American teenager with the car keys symbolized not just material prosperity, but a form of freedom that resonated across ideological divisions. As we reflect on this history, it offers insights into both the Cold War's resolution and contemporary global dynamics. Today's ideological competitions between democratic and authoritarian systems, between different models of capitalism, between secular and religious visions of society, continue to play out partly through lifestyle comparisons. Which systems deliver prosperity, freedom, and meaning to ordinary citizens, particularly youth? The answers, as during the Cold War, often prove more persuasive than abstract ideological claims. The teenage driver may seem an unlikely player in geopolitical history, more at home in American graffiti than diplomatic archives. Yet this mundane aspect of American life, taken for granted by those who lived it, represented a profound challenge to the competing superpower. In high school parking lots across America, without any strategic planning or propaganda intent, teenagers casually demonstrated a prosperity and freedom that ultimately proved more persuasive than any military parade or ideological treatise. This history also illuminates why certain symbols of American life generate such complex reactions globally, simultaneously attracting through their embodiment of freedom and prosperity, while sometimes repelling through their perceived materialism or environmental impact. The teenage driver represented genuine advantages of the American system, while also highlighting its distinctive priorities and values: the elevation of individual mobility over certain collective goods, the acceptance of high-resource consumption to enable personal freedom. For Americans who lived through this era, particularly those who experienced teenage driving as a normal rite of passage, this history provides perspective on how extraordinary these ordinary experiences appeared from outside. What seemed utterly normal, getting a license at 16, practicing in the family car, perhaps receiving a used vehicle as a graduation present, or saving for one from after-school job earnings, represented a level of prosperity and personal freedom that citizens of the competing superpower found almost impossible to believe. This contrast became particularly visible during the 1980s as information barriers weakened. Soviet young people gained increasing exposure to American teenage life through films, television shows, and music that often featured cars as central elements. From Ferris Bueller's Day Off to Fast Times at Ridgemont High, American teen-oriented media casually portrayed car ownership as a normal part of adolescence. MTV music videos frequently featured teenagers driving convertibles or gathering in parking lots around their vehicles. These images, reaching Soviet youth through various channels, created powerful impressions about the material possibilities of American life. A KGB report from 1987, declassified in the post-Soviet era, specifically warned about the influence of such media on Soviet teenagers' attitudes. The report expressed concern that American films showing high school students with personal automobiles are creating unrealistic expectations and dissatisfaction among our youth. It recommended stricter controls on such imports, but acknowledged that complete information isolation had become impossible in the satellite age. By the final years of the Soviet Union, the automobile gap had become just one aspect of a broader recognition that the communist system had failed to deliver its promised prosperity. Young people, in particular, increasingly measured their society against Western alternatives using visible lifestyle metrics that required no ideological interpretation. The teenager with car keys represented a freedom and possibility that Soviet youth could see but not experience, a tangible reminder of their system's limitations. When the Berlin Wall fell in 1989 and Soviet control over Eastern Europe collapsed, one of the most striking initial changes was the flood of Western consumer goods, with automobiles among the most desired. In East Germany, where citizens had waited years for poorly made Trabants, the sudden access to West German cars represented not just improved transportation, but a tangible symbol of the freedom they had been denied. Young people were particularly eager to participate in this new car culture, seeing in it the autonomy their Western counterparts had long enjoyed. The ultimate dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991 stemmed from multiple complex factors, but the persistent failure to match Western living standards, visibly symbolized by the automobile gap, played a crucial delegitimizing role. When ordinary citizens lost faith in the system's ability to deliver its material promises, its moral and ideological claims lost persuasive power. The American teenager with a car, once a distant image, had become a powerful symbol of what might be possible in a different system. In the post-Soviet era, car ownership expanded dramatically across the former USSR, though in ways that created new social tensions. The chaotic privatization of the 1990s produced extreme wealth disparities, with newly rich oligarchs and their children displaying ostentatious luxury vehicles, while many citizens struggled with economic collapse. In Moscow, the sight of teenagers driving Mercedes and BMWs became a striking symbol of the new inequalities, replacing the old nomenclature of privileges with even more extreme disparities. For average citizens, however, car ownership gradually became more accessible, though never reaching American levels. Used car markets developed, import restrictions eased, and manufacturing joint ventures with Western companies increased availability. By the early 2000s, driving schools had proliferated across Russia and other post-Soviet states, and obtaining a license at 18, the legal minimum in most post-Soviet countries, had become a common aspiration for urban youth. American car culture itself evolved significantly during these decades. The energy crises of the 1970s, growing environmental awareness, and economic challenges modified the teenage driving experience. Smaller, more efficient cars largely replaced the gas-guzzling behemoths of the 1950s and 1960s. Insurance rates for young drivers increased substantially, making car ownership more financially challenging. In the early 21st century, some studies began showing declining interest in driving among American teenagers, particularly in urban areas with improved public transportation and ride-sharing options. Nevertheless, through the end of the 20th century and beyond, the expectation that a teenager would learn to drive and often have access to a vehicle remained ingrained in American culture. Driver's education continued in most high schools. Obtaining a license at 16 remained a significant milestone, and high school parking lots continued to fill with student vehicles, a sight that still surprises visitors from countries where such youth autonomy remains uncommon. This persistent cultural difference reflects something deeper than economic disparities. It speaks to fundamentally different conceptions of youth, responsibility, freedom, and the relationship between individual and society. The American teenager with a car embodies particular values, mobility, independence, individual responsibility, that align with broader cultural emphasis on personal freedom and spatial mobility. The normalization of teenage driving represents a societal choice to prioritize individual autonomy over certain collective considerations, with both benefits and costs. For those who lived through the Cold War on the eastern side, the contrast remains memorable. Mikhail Gorbachev, in his memoirs, specifically mentioned his first visit to Canada in 1983, where he was struck by the casual affluence of ordinary people, particularly the young. He recalled asking his host about teenagers driving their own cars and being told it was completely normal, a moment he described as making him understand viscerally, not just intellectually, the depth of our economic problems. Similarly, Vladimir Posner, the Soviet journalist who became famous for his appearances on American television during the 1980s, has written about the automobile shock he experienced during his first extended stay in the United States. Though familiar with America from earlier periods in his life, he noted that nothing had prepared him for seeing high school parking lots filled with students' cars, and how this tangible evidence of prosperity affected his understanding of the competing systems. Even ordinary citizens retain powerful memories of this disparity. Surveys of Russians who lived through the late Soviet period consistently mention learning about Western living standards as a significant factor in their disillusionment with communism. The teenage driver frequently appears in these recollections alongside other symbols of American abundance that seemed particularly striking in comparison to Soviet austerity. What made the automobile gap particularly potent was its visibility and comprehensibility. Unlike abstract economic statistics or complex technological achievements, car ownership represented a form of prosperity that required no explanation. When Soviet citizens saw American teenagers driving their own vehicles, whether in person during visits or through increasingly available media, they understood immediately what this represented about the respective economic systems. This understanding operated at multiple levels. At the most basic, it demonstrated production capacity. The American economy simply made more cars, making them accessible even to young people. At a deeper level, it revealed different priorities in resource allocation. America chose to direct substantial resources toward individual mobility and consumer satisfaction, rather than concentrating exclusively on heavy industry or military power. Most profoundly, it reflected philosophical differences about individual freedom versus collective organization, with the teenage driver embodying America's emphasis on personal autonomy. The Cold War is often portrayed primarily as a military standoff or an ideological debate conducted through propaganda. Yet, in the lived experience of ordinary citizens, particularly younger generations, it was often experienced most powerfully through such material and lifestyle contrasts. The teenager with a car became, almost accidentally, one of America's most effective ambassadors, demonstrating through everyday life a prosperity and freedom that communist propaganda struggled to counter. This dynamic was understood by some American policymakers who argued for increased cultural exchanges and information flow into the Soviet bloc. George Kennan, the architect of America's containment policy, argued as early as the 1950s that exposure to American living standards would ultimately prove more powerful than military pressure in challenging Soviet legitimacy. By the 1980s, this approach had become more explicit, with increased efforts to showcase American lifestyle through exchanges, exhibitions, and media penetration. What these policymakers understood was that ideological arguments rarely persuade on their own. Abstract debates about capitalism versus communism had limited impact compared to tangible lifestyle differences. The American teenager with car keys in hand represented a form of freedom that required no theoretical explanation. It spoke directly to universal human desires for autonomy, status, and possibility. As the Cold War recedes into history, this aspect of the conflict deserves greater recognition. While diplomatic negotiations, military posturing, and espionage operations dominate historical accounts, the ultimate resolution came partly through ordinary citizens losing faith in the communist future. This loss of faith was fueled by growing awareness of alternatives with visible lifestyle disparities, like teenage drivers, playing a crucial role in making abstract systemic differences concrete and personally relevant. The fall of the Soviet system in the face of these challenges offers insights into both historical dynamics and contemporary global competitions. Today's ideological contests between democratic and authoritarian systems, between different models of capitalism, between secular and religious visions of society, continue to play out partly through lifestyle comparisons. Which systems deliver prosperity, freedom, and meaning to ordinary citizens, particularly youth? The answers, as during the Cold War, often prove more persuasive than abstract ideological claims. The teenage driver may seem an unlikely player in geopolitical history, more at home in American graffiti than diplomatic archives. Yet this mundane aspect of American life, taken for granted by those who lived it, represented a profound challenge to the competing superpower. In high school parking lots across America, without any strategic planning or propaganda intent, teenagers casually demonstrated a prosperity and freedom that ultimately proved more persuasive than any military parade or ideological treatise. This history also illuminates why certain symbols of American life generate such complex reactions globally, simultaneously attracting through their embodiment of freedom and prosperity, while sometimes repelling through their perceived materialism or environmental impact. The teenage driver represented genuine advantages of the American system, while also highlighting its distinctive priorities and values: the elevation of individual mobility over certain collective goods, the acceptance of high-resource consumption to enable personal freedom. For many former Soviet citizens who emigrated to the West, the experience of automobile ownership, including for their children, represented a particularly meaningful aspect of their new lives. Surveys of Russian immigrants to the United States consistently mention car ownership as one of the most significant tangible improvements in their standard of living. Parents often express particular satisfaction in being able to provide their teenagers with the driving opportunities they themselves never had in their youth. Today, car ownership has expanded globally, including in the former Soviet space, though significant variations remain in patterns of teenage access to vehicles. Cultural attitudes toward youth independence, infrastructure development, environmental considerations, and economic factors all shape different societies' approaches to teenage driving. The American model, where getting a license at 16 and soon after having access to a car remains a common expectation, represents just one approach, albeit one that proved surprisingly significant in the ideological competitions of the 20th century. As we reflect on this history, perhaps its most important lesson is how ordinary aspects of daily life can carry extraordinary geopolitical significance when they embody fundamental differences between competing systems. The teenage driver, commonplace in America, unimaginable in the Soviet Union, represented not just an economic disparity, but a different vision of the relationship between youth, society, and freedom. That this difference proved more consequential than many carefully orchestrated propaganda efforts reminds us that the most powerful ideological statements often come not from declarations, but from lived experiences. The parking lots of American high schools, filled with students' cars, never set out to challenge a superpower. Yet, in their ordinary reality, they demonstrated a prosperity and freedom that ultimately proved more compelling than any ideology. The Soviet teenager, gazing at images of American counterparts with car keys in hand, glimpsed not just a consumer product but a different set of possibilities for life, possibilities that would help shape the aspirations that ultimately transformed their world.